This month we're going to be looking at the pin tucking cord guides. We'll also look at the pin tucking feet that you utilize with the guides, but our lovely accessory of the month is our pin tucking cord guides. So these are our lovely guides here. It does come as 2 in a set, and what they are is they fit into the front of your needle plate where your little bobbin cover is, and they've got this little guide at the front of the little door that has either got a thinner or a thicker little sort of dome that your thread then goes through, that goes under your corded pin tucks. So pin tucks you can either do just with stitching, either 2 lines together, generally with a twin needle, or these ones are for corded pin tucks where you actually get like a nice sort of 3 dimension to them. So you utilize the guide for the size of the cord that you're putting through. You then utilize a pin tucking foot depending on the cord, and then you've also got twin needles. So I'll show you here some of the feet. So here we have a 5, 7 and 9 mil feet, and if we turn these over you should be able to see then. We have a thinner one, or often called the narrow pin tucking foot, and then a wide pin tucking foot. Depending on what model machine you have will determine which one you need to buy. Some of them come in sets, some of them come individually, so just check with your local Janome store and they'll be able to help you with both the right guides that you need to buy for your model plus the correct feet that you need to buy. So what you do is you determine the thickness of your cord. So we have a thin cord and a thicker style cord here, depending on what size you need. So if it's the thin one, we would use the thin guide plate, and we just clip that in there, and we would utilize that with the narrow pin tucking foot. And if we have a thicker cord, we would use the thicker guide with the wider foot. So that gives you an idea. It does list on the blister pack packaging, it lists which guide to use depending on the thickness of your cord. So, and there are different guides depending on what model machine you have. So as I stated earlier, just check which one you need for your machine. So I'm just going to take this one out of the way because I'm going to get that ready to go on my machine. And what you do is you take the little door off the front of your machine. So I'm just going to click my little door here off my needle plate, and then this little guide clips in the same way it would be if you were replacing that little door. Then you'll notice that the guide on the needle plate has got the cord that will run exactly up through the center. And if we take this little cord back in and clip it in, you'll see there that my cord will then run right up the center of my needle plate to be able to be stitched in. Now these guides are utilized with a normal sort of 2mm wide twin needle. So you can see here that that will then sit over and stitch a line either side of the cord. And with the wider cord you can also go up to a 4mm, and I'll show you a little bit later some examples where I've stitched with different width of twin needles. So for your pin tucking, we've got our cord guide, we've got the correct foot, we've got a twin needle. The other thing you need is you need to be able to thread your machine up with 2 rolls of thread. So depending on your machine, you may need to utilize your second spool holder. So your spool holder may look like this style, may look like this style, or it may be getting a thread stand that hooks on the back of your machine. So it just depends on what model you've got. Again, check your instruction book out for utilizing your second spool holder, and that will give you instructions about how to thread the machine up with your 2 threads as well. Then you need obviously your 2 rolls of thread and 1 roll of bobbin. Now when we're putting our thread onto our spool stands as well, we normally need to use some sort of spool stopper. So if we utilize this one, and I'll show you, so I'm going to put my spool of thread onto my spool stand, and then you would utilize a spool cap. If I put this one in here, you'll notice that it's quite large. This is not the right one for this thread because it's too big. You see how it's actually bigger than my thread. What you want to do is you can utilize with these spools of thread, you can either utilize the small one if that's what you've got, or you can utilize the special. These are the little special ones, and that just clips in there and it will hold that thread in place. So the thread, as the machine takes the thread off the spool, it doesn't then fall off the spool stand. So these spool caps, you generally will get some with your machine, whether it be a large or a small, and sometimes depending on the model you will get the specials, but you can purchase all of those as well. So you can just contact your local Janome stockist, and depending on what thread you're using, they'll be able to advise you exactly the right one for your machine. So I've set my machine up for pin tucking. So just have a look in your manual to whether you need to go into your sewing applications or whether you need to make some adjustments manually. Generally for twin needling, you might have a twin needle button you might need to push on. And for pin tucking in particular with the cords, you need to make your thread tension a little bit tighter. So we've taken our thread tension up to 7. So I'm going to take my little cord guide A, so that's my skinny one. So we're going to place that into the little needle plate there. We're then going to take our narrow 9mm foot. This one does have an N2 written on it. And we place that on the bottom of our regular shank. I've got my twin needle in, so let's go ahead and thread our machine up. Now for threading twin needles, I generally start with one thread, thread that all the way down to the needle, and then I do my second thread. So I'm placing my thread onto my standard spool stand, and then up here I've got my secondary spool stand ready to go. We then thread this following our instructional book to how you thread your machine. And when we come down here to our needles, the main thing with a twin needle is you cannot utilize your needle threader. Okay, so you do have to lovely manually, and we get so used to some of these tools, don't we, that we are going to thread my left hand. It doesn't really matter whether you do the left or the right first, as long as you do one needle from thread spool all the way down to the needle, then you won't get any twisting. We then take our second roll of thread and my second spool cap. We're going to place that on the thread stand, place our little spool cap on there, and then we will thread up. So it's exactly the same thread channel that we're using, and depending on your model of machine, you may need to lock your machine or set it up however your manual says to set it up for threading. So then we bring it down here and we thread our other needle. So I've got both my needles threaded. When you've got it threaded, because we've done one at a time, because they're going through the same channel and the same thread guides under here above the needle, occasionally they may look like they're getting twisted, but as long as you have threaded one and then the second one all the way down to the eye of the needle, they won't get twisted anywhere. They just sometimes appear to be twisting, but because if they do twist, one, you're going to break your threads, and then you're probably going to break your needle as well. We don't want that to be happening. So then we're going to take our cord. So I'm using the narrow foot with the A guide, so that's my narrow guide. I'm going to take a narrow cord, and with this it's very easy. There's a little metal guide at the front, and you just slide that in and my cord is ready in position. I'm then going to take my fabric and we will start stitching. I just like to hold on to the cord at the back just to keep that in the right spot, but the guide will help put that thread exactly where it needs to be under here, that it's going to come out just in front of where those 2 needles are. And then we can stitch our first row. Now when you get to the end here, you can use your thread cutter if you have one on your machine, or you can manually cut the thread. So it just depends on your model. I'm just using regular sort of like sewing thread here, so there's no problem with me using my thread cutter. But if you try it on your machine and it makes a sort of a funny noise or anything like that, then please just always cut manually. We're then going to cut off the thread that we've used for the corded pin tuck, and I don't know which one will be the best camera, but we'll go here to start with. So we've got our twin needles that are stitched either side of the cord, and if we turn this over, you see sort of like a little bit of a zigzag happening, and that's our one bobbin thread that's getting caught by both needles, and that's why it looks like a bit of a sort of a Z zigzag going through there, and that's called a corded pin tuck. So what you'll find the difference between if I just did some stitching, and I might show you that actually, if I just do some stitching without the cord, what you'll see is that it still looks similar, but there's no bulk behind it, so that they can eventually, the pin tuck can sort of come out and you don't get the same sort of look to it. So it might be very tricky to see this on camera, but this one here is quite flat compared to the one that's actually got the cord behind it. So that cord being in there keeps that nice 3-dimensional pin tuck happening, whereas this one, which has got no cord, does eventually go quite flat, and all you will see then is your 2 rows of stitching coming down. Now on the front of the foot, we might maybe swap back to this camera just so I can show you, because I forgot to show you earlier about the bottom of the feet. So on the bottom of the feet there is multiple channels, and what they are for is when you're stitching multiple rows, that your cord, so to start with your first row, your cord will lay in the center of the foot, and then when you want to do subsequent rows that might be close to where the thread would have been, is you can move your cord, your previous row that you've stitched, into these other channels depending on how wide you want in between your rows, and that way it will stitch perfectly. So I've come back to my machine and we're going to stitch our second row. So what I would do is I'm sitting here and I will decide from my center position how many grooves. So on the narrow one I've got 4 grooves on either side of my center position. So I might decide I want to come over 2 grooves or 3 grooves depending on how much gap I want to have in between each row. So we're going to go 2 grooves over. So I'm skipping the first little row and going into the second row, and that's where this previous cord is going to be sitting. So then we stitch our second row here. And then we can trim our cord. And if we want to do a third row, it's just repeating that process. And I'm again going to come over to my second groove across, will be the previous one I just stitched, and then you will notice that your the first row you sewed is then now sitting in this end one. Makes it really easy when you're doing multiple rows, having those little cords on the back of the foot to use as guides. Okay, so we're going to put this over here so you can have a look, and I'll put one of my feet down on here and you should then be able to see. So when we did our first row, we did this one here and we stitched it down the center. Then when we moved it over, we put the row we'd previously done in that second channel and we stitched down. And then we moved it over again to the next one and stitched down. So that way you use these little channels that are on the back of the foot, these little grooves there, as a guide for your previous rows of stitching. So there we have a couple of rows that have been stitched with the narrow guide and the narrow foot. We're going to swap over to our wider guide now and the wider foot. So let me get my little guide out here. So it's very easy. I'm just going to flick off the little door from the previous guide, put our next guide in. I'm going to take my narrow foot off and put my wide foot on. So the wide foot and the wide guide literally have larger channels to take a larger, thicker thread. It does note on the back of the blister pack what size cords you can use, but I think the thin one is generally up to about 1.5 mil and the thick one is up to about 2 mil. So then it is exactly the same process that I would use to stitch the thicker one. Trim off the cord, get the cord straight again. So now again I could decide I might want to come over 3 guides now to have a wider gap. Just going to get a bit more cord. So I've got my cord just sort of pulling at the front of my machine here so it doesn't get caught on anything. And as I'm sewing, I'm just keeping my eye on this previous row I've stitched, going through that little guide. Okay, and let's do another one. We're going to do this one right close next to, so I'm only gone over into the the first cord guide. I'll just get my cord. So this one we are just moving over to do it right next to it, so I'm just in the first little guide from my previous row that I stitched. So let's bring this down here. Bring down the foot so we can see here if we wanted the 2 rows right next to each other. I've gone from the row just next to it, whereas this one here you can see there's a bigger gap because I've gone over 3 rows. So this has all been done with the 2mm twin needle. You can also stitch with the wider one. So if I bring in my little sample here, I've got a couple of ones here that I can show you. Move my stuff out of the way. So these first ones here I did with the 2mm twin needle. So this is with the narrow and then with the wider cord. And then this third sample here I did with the 4mm, so the wider twin needle, but it's the same cord that's in this one. So these two are using exactly the same, those larger guides and the larger foot, but it's just changing the size of the twin needle that you're utilizing. Then we also have over here, I've gone back to my normal 2mm twin needle, but as I was stitching I've moved my fabric to create some curvy lines. So that's another thing you can do to add a little bit more texture to whatever you're sewing. And then on this final little sample here we've also utilized a triple stitch or a sashiko style of stitch. This particular one does a straight stitch and then a triple and then a straight, and that just gives it another sort of look and effect. So I'll bring in here the little project that we have done for this month. So it is this cute little Halloween bag that we've made, and you can see here that we have pin tucked the fabric, and that is going all the way through, and it gives it these lovely little ridges on there, so it looks like it is actually a pumpkin. So I can imagine the kids trick-or-treating with this, and then when that gets sort of filled up with things, it's going to look like a little pumpkin. And then obviously we've then appliqued some little shapes on the front to create a carved pumpkin look. And we do have one other little example here that I'm going to bring in. So this is a lovely little girl's dress that we've done, and what we've done is we've done some pin tucking on the top and some decorative stitching. So up here we've done 3 rows of stitching with the corded pin tucks with a normal straight stitch, and they look like they're 2 grooves apart. And then when you come into the center here, we've done some with that sort of decorative sashiko style stitch and intermix those with normal stitch and then the decorative stitch again, and changed the difference. These ones are a bit wider apart than the smaller ones. And then we've just got some decorative stitching in here with a beautiful metallic thread, and that makes a gorgeous little yoke part for this dress. So thank you very much for joining us to learn all about the pin tucking cord guides.